On Mother's Day, my millionaire son asked if I liked the condo he bought me. I froze. What condo? I asked. My daughter-in-law slowly lowered her wine glass. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has reached. The dining room suddenly felt too quiet. Just seconds earlier, everything had seemed normal. Warm even. The soft jazz music playing through the ceiling speakers. The smell of rosemary chicken drifting from the kitchen island. The expensive candles my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, always lit during holidays. The kind that smelled like cedarwood and vanilla and probably cost more than my weekly grocery bill. Now the silence sat between us like broken glass. David stared at me from across the table, his smile slowly fading. At 38, my son had the kind of face magazines like to photograph. Sharp jawline. Perfect teeth. Tailored navy sweater. Everything about him looked polished now. Successful. Untouchable. Nothing like the little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder after Little League games. What do you mean, what condo? He asked carefully. I felt heat rising into my chest. Honey, I don't know what you're talking about. Beside him, Vanessa adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist. She still wasn't looking at me. David gave a small laugh, but it sounded forced. Mom, the condo in Naples. The one I bought for you 3 years ago. Naples, Florida. Near the beach. My heart skipped painfully. I had never even been to Naples. I swallowed hard. David, I think I would remember if someone bought me a condo. The room went still again. Outside the enormous windows behind them, rain tapped softly against the glass. Typical Seattle weather. Gray skies. Wet streets. The kind of cold that settles into your bones when you get older. Vanessa finally looked up. Oh, she said lightly. Maybe you forgot about the paperwork. There was a lot going on back then. Forgot?
Ich zerrte her.
For the past 3 winters, I had been working part-time at a church thrift store because my Social Security checks barely covered rent and medication. Last December, my heater broke during a cold snap, and I spent 6 nights sleeping under 3 blankets wearing wool socks and my late husband's old flannel robe. And somehow, according to her, I had forgotten owning beachfront property? David frowned now. No, that doesn't make sense. He reached for his wine glass but didn't drink from it. I wired the down payment myself, he said slowly. And I set up monthly maintenance transfers too. Monthly transfers. The words hit me harder than the condo itself. I blinked. What transfers? Now David looked genuinely confused. The money I send every month for taxes, HOA fees, utilities, he paused. Mom, you've been getting those payments, right? I felt my stomach twist.
No, he whispered.
Vanessa shifted in her chair. David turned toward her slightly. You handled most of the paperwork, didn't you? Her smile appeared too quickly. Well, your assistant sent everything over to your mom's address. Maybe there was some mix-up. Mix-up. Such a harmless little word. Like lost luggage at an airport. Not 3 years of someone's life. I lowered my eyes to my plate, suddenly unable to look at either of them. The chicken had gone cold. My fingers trembled slightly against the cloth napkin in my lap. I pressed them down before anyone noticed. 3 years. 3 years of clipping coupons. 3 years of pretending canned soup counted as dinner. 3 years of smiling during short phone calls with my son and saying, I'm doing just fine, sweetheart. I remembered standing in line at the pharmacy last fall, quietly putting one of my prescriptions back because I couldn't afford both medications that month. I remembered selling Harold's watch collection after my car transmission failed. I remembered crying in the laundry room of my apartment building because someone had stolen my detergent, and I couldn't afford another bottle until Friday. And all this time, David rubbed a hand across his face. Mom, this can't be right. I looked at him then. Really looked at him. For the first time that evening, I saw fear creeping into his expression. Not fear for money. Fear that he had missed something terrible happening right in front of him. Vanessa suddenly stood up. I'm going to check dessert, she announced quickly. Nobody stopped her. She disappeared into the kitchen too fast. David watched her leave. Then he slowly reached for his phone. What's the address? I asked quietly. He glanced at me. What? The condo, I said. What's the address? His thumbs moved across the screen. After a moment, he turned the phone toward me. A photograph filled the display. White building, palm trees, blue water in the distance. Beautiful, peaceful. The kind of place Harold and I used to dream about retiring to someday before cancer took him. My chest tightened so sharply it hurt to breathe. That's mine, I asked softly. David nodded once. I stared at the screen, then at my own reflection faintly mirrored against the dark dining room window beside us. 70 years old, working part-time, living in a one-bedroom apartment with peeling linoleum floors. While somewhere in Florida, there was supposedly a home with my name attached to it, a home I had never seen. From the kitchen, I heard the faint sound of a cabinet slamming shut. Vanessa! David heard it too. Slowly, very slowly, he lowered his phone. And for the first time that night, my son looked afraid of his own wife. I barely slept that night. Rain hit the windows of my apartment in slow, uneven taps, and every time the old pipes rattled inside the walls, I opened my eyes again. My bedroom smelled faintly like lavender detergent, and the peppermint cream I rubbed onto my knees before bed. Usually I found comfort in small routines like that. Not anymore. I lay awake staring at the water stain spreading across my ceiling and kept hearing David's voice in my head. I've been sending monthly payments. 3 years. I turned onto my side and looked at Harold's photograph on the nightstand beside me. The silver frame had started tarnishing around the edges, but I still polished the glass every Sunday morning. In the picture, he was smiling beside our old fishing boat at Lake Crescent. Sunburned nose. Baseball cap crooked like always. We were supposed to grow old together. Cancer had other plans. After Harold died, everything in my life became smaller. Smaller apartment. Smaller grocery budget. Smaller world. I sold the house 6 months after the funeral because I couldn't manage the mortgage alone. David offered to help at first, but Vanessa kept mentioning how stressful the housing market was, and how downsizing might actually be freeing. Freeing. That word had sounded comforting back then. Now it felt ugly. Around 3 in the morning, I finally gave up on sleep and shuffled into the kitchen. My apartment kitchen was barely larger than a hallway. The linoleum floor curled near the refrigerator, and one cabinet door never fully closed unless I kicked it with my foot. I filled the kettle anyway. The familiar whistle eventually broke the silence. Tea helped me think. Or at least it used to. As steam curled from my mug, I sat at the tiny table beside the window and looked around the apartment I had spent the last 3 years trying to be grateful for. The thrift store curtains. The second-hand recliner. The stack of unpaid dental bills tucked beneath a fruit bowl. All this time, I had believed my struggles were simply part of getting older. You tighten your belt. You stop buying new clothes. You learn which grocery stores mark down bread after 7 p.m. You survive quietly. That's what women my age do. But now another thought had begun creeping into my mind. What if I was never supposed to struggle like this at all? My chest tightened again. I remembered last winter during that terrible ice storm. My building lost heat for almost 12 hours, and I sat wrapped in blankets while my fingers turned stiff from cold. David had called that evening. "Mom, you okay over there?" He lied instantly. "Oh, I'm perfectly fine, sweetheart." Meanwhile, according to him, there had been a condo sitting empty in Florida with my name attached to it. The humiliation settled deeper than the anger. That was the part one couldn't explain to myself. Someone had watched me live this way. Someone had known. The next morning, my phone rang at exactly 8:12 a.m. "David." I stared at the screen before answering. Une. His voice sounded rough. "Did I wake you?" "I've been awake for hours." A pause. Then quieter. "Mom, we need to talk." I looked down at my tea. "I figured." He exhaled slowly. "I checked some records last night after you left." After I left. I'd barely remembered driving home from their house. The roads had blurred together through the rain. "And?" I asked carefully. "There were transfers," he said. "Large ones. Every month." My grip tightened around the mug. "Where did they go?" Another silence. Then, "To an account connected to Vanessa." I closed my eyes. Not because I was shocked anymore. Because hearing it out loud made it real. Outside my apartment window, a garbage truck groaned down the street while gulls circled above the marina nearby. Life continuing normally. Meanwhile, mine felt like it had quietly cracked in half. David spoke again. Mom, why didn't you tell me you were struggling? The question hurt more than I expected. I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. Because every time we talked, you sounded busy. He didn't answer. So I continued. You were opening offices in Austin, flying to Singapore, buying vacation homes. I swallowed carefully. I didn't want to become another problem. You are not a problem. The speed of his response almost broke me. For years, I had convinced myself I was doing the noble thing by staying silent. Older women do that too. We minimize ourselves. We say, I'm okay, Dad, I don't need much, don't worry about me. Until one day people believe it. David's voice lowered. Vanessa told me you wanted independence. She said you hated accepting financial help. I stared across my tiny kitchen. The sink still leaked underneath. I kept a bowl there to catch the dripping water because maintenance in the building took forever. Independence? No. Pride maybe, but not independence. She said that. I whispered. Yes. I pressed my lips together hard. Suddenly memories started rearranging themselves in my head, like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. Vanessa insisting on handling family logistics. Vanessa intercepting holiday plans. Vanessa offering to help organize Harold's paperwork after his funeral. Vanessa gently laughing whenever I tried discussing finances. Oh, Linda, numbers stress you out. Let us take care of everything. At the time, I thought she was trying to help. Now I wondered how long she had been managing my life without my knowledge. David interrupted my thoughts quietly. There's more. Something in his tone made my stomach drop. The condo isn't empty.
He sat upright slowly.
What? She's been renting it out. The room went still. How long? Another pause. Almost 3 years. I could actually hear my own heartbeat. Renting it out. Collecting the money. Using my property like her personal investment. Meanwhile, I had spent 2 summers avoiding air conditioning because my electric bill kept climbing. I looked around my kitchen again. The cracked toaster. The faded dish towels. The stack of coupons beside the microwave. And suddenly something inside me shifted. Not rage. Not yet. Something colder. Something clearer. Because for the first time since Harold died, I realized my loneliness had not happened naturally. Someone had been carefully building it around me. And the person sitting at the center of it was my daughter-in-law. By Thursday, the entire situation had begun to feel unreal. Like I had stepped into someone else's life by mistake. David called me twice a day now. That alone felt strange. For years, our conversations had lasted less than 10 minutes. Quick check-ins squeezed between meetings and airport lounges. Love you, Mom. Take your vitamins. Talk soon. Now his voice carried something heavier. Guilt. The second call came just after lunch while I was folding laundry in the basement of my apartment building. Mom, he said quietly, can you come by the house tonight? I stopped folding one of my sweaters. Vanessa's house. No, their house. The beautiful modern place overlooking Puget Sound with heated bathroom floors and a refrigerator larger than my first apartment. I suddenly felt underdressed just thinking about it. What for? I asked carefully. I found more paperwork. Something in his tone made me sit down slowly on the plastic chair beside the dryer. How bad? He exhaled. Bad. That evening, Seattle wore its usual gray expression. The sky hung low and heavy over the city, while mist drifted above the water downtown. I drove carefully. My old Toyota made a soft rattling noise every time I pressed the brakes. I'd been ignoring it for months because repairs cost money. At a red light, I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror. Silver hair pulled back neatly. Drugstore lipstick. Small pearl earrings Harold gave me on our 30th anniversary. I suddenly wondered what Vanessa saw whenever she looked at me. An old woman? An inconvenience? A bank account she thought nobody would check? By the time I reached the house, my stomach felt tight. The driveway lights glowed softly against the rain-dark pavement. Inside, warm golden light spilled through enormous windows. It looked perfect. That was the thing about beautiful homes. Sometimes they hide ugly people very well. David opened the door before I knocked. He looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes. Shirt wrinkled. Jaw tense. For the first time in years, my son looked less like a CEO and more like the overwhelmed boy who used to panic before math tests. "Hey, Mom." I stepped inside quietly. The house smelled like coffee and lemon polish. Usually Vanessa kept everything spotless. Tonight papers covered the dining table in messy stacks. Bank statements. Printed emails. Property documents. The sight made my pulse quicken. Vanessa was nowhere in sight. "Where is she?" I asked softly. David rubbed the back of his neck. "At her sister's." I nodded once. Not surprised. Rain tapped gently against the windows while he led me to the dining room. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he slid a folder toward me. "I want you to look at this." My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside were copies of rental agreements, monthly deposits, property management emails. My name appeared across the top of every page. Linda Mercer, property owner. I stared at the words until they blurred. "She made almost $4,000 a month renting it out," David said quietly. $4,000. My throat tightened painfully. I remembered standing in the canned food aisle 2 months earlier trying to calculate whether soup or oatmeal would stretch further until payday. $4,000. Every month. For 3 years. I placed the papers down carefully before my hands gave me away. "She told me you wanted the condo kept as an investment," David continued. "She said you didn't like Florida anymore after Dad passed." I almost laughed at that. Harold and I had dreamed about Florida for years. Warm weather for his arthritis. Morning walks near the water. Cheap seafood restaurants where retirees spent hours drinking coffee. We used to browse real estate listings together at night like teenagers planning an adventure. After he died, I stopped looking. Not because I stopped wanting the dream. Because dreams become expensive once you're alone. David sat across from me heavily. I should have checked sooner. I looked at him carefully. His hands were shaking now too. There was something deeply unsettling about watching your child realize he married someone he doesn't fully know. "Did she admit it?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "At first she blamed her accountant. Then she blamed my assistant." His jaw tightened. "Then she said she was protecting me." Protecting him? From what? His widowed mother owning property? I leaned back in my chair slowly. The dining room around us looked painfully elegant. Fresh flowers sat in the center of the table. Expensive artwork lined the walls. Meanwhile, my apartment ceiling still leaked when it rained hard. David swallowed hard. "Mom, there's more money missing." I closed my eyes briefly. Of course there was. "How much?" She transferred over $200,000 total. The room tilted slightly. 200,000. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying not to ask for help. All the times I told myself, "Don't burden him, he has his own family that you'll manage." Meanwhile, someone had quietly stolen enough money to completely change my life. David's voice cracked slightly. "She said she thought you'd never use it." That sentence hurt more than the theft. Not use it. As if my life had already ended. As if older women stopped deserving comfort after a certain age. I looked down at the paperwork again. One photo slipped partially from the folder. Pulled it free. The condo balcony overlooked the ocean. Blue water stretched endlessly beneath bright Florida sunlight. 2 white chairs sat outside beside a small table. Ready for morning coffee. Ready for retirement. Ready for a life I never got to live. Suddenly my chest ached so sharply I had to look away. David noticed immediately. "Mom,
I'm okay."
But I wasn't. Because grief was crawling back into me again. Not just grief for Harold this time. Grief for the years stolen afterward. The years I spent surviving instead of living. David stood abruptly and walked toward the kitchen, running both hands through his hair. "I don't even know who she is anymore." I watched my son carefully, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something important. Vanessa had not only stolen from me, she had been slowly separating David from me for years. Every missed holiday, every canceled visit, every awkward silence on phone calls, every moment I felt myself fading from my own family. Now I could finally see the pattern clearly. And once you see something clearly, you can never unsee it again. The next morning I woke up before sunrise again. For a few seconds, lying there beneath my faded quilt, I forgot everything. Then reality returned all at once. The condo. The missing money. Vanessa. I stared at the pale gray light spreading across my bedroom ceiling and felt exhaustion settle deep into my bones. Not physical exhaustion. The kind that comes when your understanding of your own life begins collapsing piece by piece. I sat up slowly, my knees aching as usual, and reached for Harold's photograph beside the bed. You always said I trusted people too easily, I whispered. The apartment remained silent. Outside, rainwater dripped steadily from the fire escape. Seattle sounded lonelier in the mornings. Especially at 70. I made coffee carefully, measuring each scoop the same way I had for years. Some habits survive heartbreak because routine is sometimes the only thing keeping a person together. While the coffee brewed, I opened the small freezer above my refrigerator. Inside sat 3 frozen dinners, a bag of peas, and half a loaf of bread. I suddenly remembered Vanessa opening her massive Sub-Zero refrigerator last Christmas. Shelves filled with imported cheeses, wine, fresh fruit flown in from somewhere tropical. Back then I told myself, good for them. They've worked hard. Now another thought crept in instead. Some of that comfort had belonged to me. The realization made me physically ill. By mid-morning David called again. Can I come by? I hesitated. My apartment embarrassed me now in a way it never had before. Not because it was small. Because my son was finally about to see how I had really been living. Still I said yes. An hour later, I heard his expensive SUV pull into the parking lot outside my building. I looked around the apartment one more time before opening the door. The worn carpet. The water stain. The old heater humming loudly near the window. David stepped inside carrying 2 coffees from the cafe near the marina. Then he stopped. Actually stopped moving. His eyes slowly traveled across the apartment. I watched the exact moment he understood. Not intellectually. Emotionally. Mom, he said softly. I forced a smile. Ignore the mess. There wasn't any mess. That made it worse. Everything was painfully neat, because small spaces only stay livable when you keep them organized. David set the coffees down slowly. You never told me it was like this. I shrugged lightly. It's enough. But even I could hear the weakness in those words now. His jaw tightened as he looked toward the kitchen. The cabinets are broken. Oh, that one sticks sometimes. And your ceiling. I put a bucket down when it rains hard. He closed his eyes briefly. I suddenly felt embarrassed in a way I hadn't expected. Not ashamed of being poor. Ashamed that my son was discovering it this late. David walked toward the bookshelf near the window. Most of the shelves held old photo albums now. I'd sold many of my books after Harold passed because storage space was limited. His fingers brushed across a framed photograph from our last family Thanksgiving before Harold got sick. Vanessa stood beside me smiling brightly in the picture. One arm wrapped around my shoulders. Looking at it now made my stomach turn. She planned this carefully, David said quietly. I didn't answer. Because deep down I had begun realizing the same thing. This wasn't impulsive greed. It was systematic. Slow. Patient. Like someone removing bricks from a foundation one at a time until the house collapses naturally. David sat across from me at the kitchen table. For a moment neither of us touched our coffee. Then he spoke. I checked more accounts last night. My stomach tightened again. There were other transfers. How many? A lot. He rubbed both hands over his face. She opened a separate LLC 2 years ago. I frowned slightly. An LLC? She used it to manage the condo rental income. His voice hardened. But she also used it for other investments. Investments. The word sounded surreal in my tiny kitchen. I had spent the last month debating whether I could afford new tires before winter. Meanwhile, Vanessa had apparently been building a secret business using money tied to my property. David slid another folder toward me. Inside were photographs, luxury handbags, jewelry purchases, spa resort invoices, private club memberships. I stared silently. Some women hide affairs. Some hide addictions. Vanessa hid an entire second life. She used your maintenance funds for this, David said. I studied one receipt carefully. A bracelet purchase. $8,000. The exact same bracelet she wore at Mother's Day dinner. Suddenly I remembered watching her adjust it nervously after I said, "What condo?" My chest tightened. Not because of the money anymore. Because of the lies. Years of them. David looked physically sick now. She told me she wanted us to build generational wealth. He laughed bitterly. Turns out she meant stealing yours. I looked down into my coffee. The cream had formed pale swirls across the surface. Harold used to say coffee tells the truth about people. If someone can't sit quietly over a cup of coffee, he'd say, they're usually hiding something. Vanessa never sat quietly. There was always noise around her. Plans. Schedules. Control. And somehow, without realizing it, we had all started orbiting around whatever version of reality she created. David suddenly asked, "Did you ever suspect anything?" I thought about it carefully, then nodded. Once. Sometimes. He looked up quickly. I folded my hands together. There were moments. I swallowed slowly. Small things. Like Vanessa insisting holiday dinners rotate away from my house after Harold died. Like family vacations I somehow learned about after they happened. Like birthday gifts growing strangely practical. Blankets. Vitamin baskets. Slippers. Old woman gifts. As though my life had already narrowed down to waiting quietly indoors. I thought maybe I was imagining it, I admitted softly. David looked devastated. She isolated you. The words hung heavily between us. Yes, that was exactly what happened. Not all at once. Slowly. Carefully. Like fog creeping over water until you can't see the shoreline anymore. And the worst part? I had blamed myself for years. Age does that to women sometimes. You begin questioning your own importance before anyone else has to. David suddenly stood and walked toward the window. Rain streaked across the glass behind him while ferries moved slowly across Elliott Bay in the distance. She's coming home tonight, he said quietly. I looked up. And his shoulders stiffened. And this ends tonight. I spent the rest of that afternoon unable to focus on anything. I tried reading. Tried folding laundry. Tried watching an old cooking show Harold used to like. Nothing worked. My nerves felt stretched too tightly. Around 6 o'clock, rain started falling harder outside my apartment windows. Thick silver streaks slid down the glass while distant thunder rolled across the bay. Seattle looked cold enough to disappear into. David texted me at 6:14. She's here. That was all it said. No explanation. No details. Just 3 words that made my stomach knot instantly. For a long moment, I stared at the message without replying. Then my phone rang. David. I answered quietly. Hello. His breathing sounded uneven. Mom, he said. I think you should hear this. Before I could respond, I heard movement. Voices. Then Vanessa. Sharp. Defensive. I already told you I was protecting our assets. David's voice exploded louder than I had heard since he was a teenager. By stealing from my mother? Silence followed. Heavy silence. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. Rain hammered the windows harder now. I was managing things. Vanessa snapped. Your mother would have wasted that property. My fingers tightened around the phone. Wasted it. The condo Harold and I once dreamed about. The money meant to make my final years easier. She spoke about it like I was some reckless stranger. David sounded stunned. She was working at a thrift store, Vanessa. A pause. Then, I didn't know it was that bad. That sentence changed something inside me. Not because it was cruel. Because it was honest. She truly hadn't cared enough to know. I closed my eyes. For years I had invited this woman to Christmas dinners. Bought gifts for her birthdays. Sat through long conversations about her yoga instructors and kitchen renovations and wine clubs. Meanwhile, she had watched me disappear piece by piece. And never once looked closely enough to notice. David's voice lowered dangerously. How long were you planning to keep this going? Vanessa answered immediately this time. Until your mother passed away. The room around me went completely still. Even the rain seemed distant suddenly. She's 70, David. Vanessa continued impatiently. The condo would have ended up yours eventually anyway. My chest hurt so sharply I pressed a hand against it. Not because she wanted the money. Because she had already mentally erased me from the future. As if I were halfway gone already. I heard David moving around the room. Then glass shattered somewhere in the background. For one terrifying second I thought he had hit something. Or someone. But when he spoke again, his voice sounded broken more than angry. You used me. Vanessa laughed once. A short, humorless sound. Oh please. Your entire family uses money to avoid difficult conversations. That shut him up. And unfortunately, part of me understood what she meant. After Harold died, David buried himself in work. I buried myself in survival. Neither of us noticed the space growing between us because money kept creating the illusion that everything was fine. Successful son. Independent mother. Perfect family photos during holidays. Meanwhile, loneliness had been quietly spreading underneath all of it like mold behind wallpaper. Vanessa spoke again. You were never around enough to notice anything anyway. David didn't answer immediately, because she was right about that too. Finally he said quietly, Get out. A pause. What? You heard me. His voice had turned cold now. Colder than I'd ever heard before. Pack your things and leave. I realized I was holding my breath. Then Vanessa laughed again. But this time there was panic underneath it. You can't be serious. I am. You're choosing her over your wife? The question echoed painfully through the phone. Because that was how Vanessa saw the situation. A competition. One woman winning space in David's life while the other lost it. She never understood motherhood. Not really. Mothers don't compete with their children. We quietly shrink ourselves so they have room to grow. Sometimes we shrink too much. David answered her softly. No. I'm choosing reality. Silence. Then footsteps. Drawers opening. Closet doors slamming. I suddenly felt exhausted beyond words. David, I whispered into the phone. He came back a moment later breathing hard. Mom, you don't have to do this tonight. Yes, he said immediately. Ido. I looked around my tiny apartment kitchen again. The dripping sink. The flickering overhead light. The grocery list stuck to my refrigerator with an old magnet. Meanwhile, somewhere across the city, my daughter-in-law was packing designer luggage bought with stolen money. The contrast felt surreal. David spoke quietly again. There's something else. My stomach dropped. What now? She transferred the condo deed. I froze. What? It's legally under another holding company now. We're calling my attorney first thing tomorrow. For a moment I couldn't speak. Even after being caught, she had still tried protecting the money. Protecting herself. I suddenly remembered something Harold once told me after one of his business partners got arrested for fraud years ago. Some people stop seeing human beings once money gets involved, he'd said. After that, everyone becomes either an obstacle or an opportunity. That was Vanessa. I finally understood it now. Not evil in dramatic ways. Worse. Practical. Calculated. The kind of person who could smile warmly while dismantling your life quietly in the background. David interrupted my thoughts softly. I'm sorry, Mom. His voice cracked on the last word. And suddenly I pictured him at 8 years old after breaking Harold's fishing rod accidentally, standing in the garage crying because he thought disappointing us meant losing our love. He sounded exactly the same now. I swallowed hard. This isn't your shame to carry, I told him quietly. But deep down we both knew shame had already entered the room. And once shame enters a family, changes everyone inside it. The next morning, Seattle woke beneath heavy fog. From my apartment window, the marina had almost disappeared completely. Boats floated like pale shadows in the distance while gulls cried somewhere beyond the mist. I stood at the sink washing. The same coffee mug twice because my mind refused to settle. Vanessa was gone. At least physically. But the damage she left behind still sat everywhere now. Impossible to ignore. At 9:03 a.m. David arrived. This time he looked worse. Not angry anymore. Drained. There's a difference. Anger burns hot and fast. Grief just keeps eating. I opened the door before he knocked. You look tired, I said softly. He gave a weak laugh. I didn't sleep. Neither had I. He stepped inside carrying a leather folder beneath one arm. His wedding ring was gone. I noticed immediately. So did he. His hand twitched slightly when he realized where my eyes had landed. I took it off last night. I nodded once. No dramatic speech. No questions. At our age, silence often says enough. David sat at the kitchen table while I poured coffee for both of us. Outside, rainwater slid slowly down the windows. Inside, the apartment heater rattled unevenly again. Usually I found the sound annoying. Today it just reminded me I was still here. Still surviving. David opened the folder carefully. My attorney started reviewing everything this morning. I sat across from him quietly. There are 7 separate accounts connected to Vanessa's LLC. 7. The number alone exhausted me. She moved money constantly, he continued. Different banks. Different investment groups. Rental income. Wire transfers. I stared into my coffee. Vanessa had always seemed obsessed with organization. Color-coded calendars. Labeled pantry containers. Perfect spreadsheets. Now I understood something important. Control was never a personality trait for her. It was survival. David slid several pages toward me. Numbers filled every line. Transfers. Deposits. Property fees. My eyes stopped on one particular date. December 14th. Last winter. What happened that month? I asked quietly. David checked the page. That was one of the largest withdrawals. I swallowed slowly. December 14th was the same week my electricity got shut off for almost 2 days. I remembered sitting beneath blankets wearing gloves indoors while pretending it wasn't serious. I had called David that week too. Not for money. Just to hear his voice. Vanessa answered instead. Oh Linda, he's in meetings all day, she'd said warmly. Can I take a message? I never mentioned the electricity. I didn't want to sound needy. Now my stomach twisted realizing what she had probably been doing immediately after hanging up. Moving my money between accounts. David noticed. My expression. What is it? I looked at him carefully. My power got disconnected that week. The color drained from his face. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he leaned back heavily and covered his mouth with one hand. Oh my God. The grief in his voice almost hurt more than my own. I suddenly understood something difficult then. David wasn't only mourning his marriage. He was mourning the version of himself he thought existed inside it. That kind of loss changes people. Finally he whispered. How did I not see this? I answered honestly. Because you trusted your wife. And because successful people often mistake comfort for truth. If life looks polished enough from outside, nobody checks the foundation. David rubbed both hands across his face again. She cried after you hung up last night. I looked up. What? She said she loved me. Said she panicked after your dad died, because she thought I'd start supporting you financially forever. I almost laughed. Supporting me forever. As if I were some enormous burden. I had spent my entire life trying not to burden anyone. Women from my generation were raised that way. You stay useful. Stay polite. Stay grateful. Even when your own life is quietly shrinking around you. David continued bitterly. She said she deserved compensation for managing family responsibilities. Compensation? The word settled coldly inside me. That was the tragedy of people like Vanessa. Eventually they turn love into transactions. Marriage becomes leverage. Family becomes strategy. And aging parents become loose financial ends to control. I stood slowly and walked toward the window. Fog still covered most of the marina now. You know what hurts the most? I asked quietly. David looked up. I really loved her. He closed his eyes. I know.
No, I whispered softly.
I mean truly loved her. I remembered helping Vanessa choose flowers for her wedding. Helping paint the nursery before my grandson was born. Babysitting during sleepless nights so she could rest. I defended her constantly whenever relatives called her controlling. I thought we were family. Maybe that was the cruelest part. People can only betray the love you genuinely give them. Behind me, David spoke quietly. She's contesting everything. I turned slowly. What does that mean? She hired her own attorney this morning. Of course she did. David looked exhausted again. She claims the condo was a marital asset because she managed the property. The audacity of it almost impressed me. Almost. I walked back to the table slowly and sat down. For several moments I said nothing. Then finally, she still thinks this is about money. David frowned slightly. What do you mean? I folded my hands together carefully. She doesn't understand what she actually stole. Not just rent payments. Not just property. She stole peace. Security. Years I could have spent grieving Harold properly instead of worrying about bills and broken appliances. Years of dignity. David's eyes lowered slowly. And I think that was the moment my son finally understood something too. Poverty feels different when it's forced onto you by someone who smiles at your dinner table. The apartment suddenly felt very quiet again. Then David reached across the table and gently placed a set of keys in front of me. I stared down at them. Silver keys. Palm tree keychain. Florida plates attached. The condo, he said softly. It's yours now. For a moment I couldn't breathe at all. I stared at the keys for a very long time. They looked strangely ordinary sitting there on my scratched kitchen table. Just metal. Just a keychain. And yet somehow they represented 3 stolen years of my life. The lawyer transferred everything back this morning, David said quietly. Temporary emergency order until the full case is settled. I reached forward slowly and touched the palm tree keychain with my fingertips. Warm Florida sunlight. Ocean air. The retirement Harold and I spent decades talking about. All reduced to a small piece of silver metal in front of me. I don't know what to say, I whispered. David looked down. You shouldn't have to say anything. But I could already see it in his face. The guilt. Not because he stole from me. Because he hadn't noticed I was disappearing. There's a particular heartbreak older parents rarely admit out loud. Watching your child become a stranger gradually enough that neither of you realizes it's happening. I picked up the keys carefully. They felt heavier than they should have. When do I leave? I asked softly. David blinked. Leave. For Florida. For the first time in days, something close to relief crossed his face. You'd really go? I almost smiled. Harold spent 20 years talking about fishing near the Gulf. My throat tightened slightly. Seems unfair to let the dream die completely. Outside, the fog had finally begun lifting from the marina. Pale morning sunlight shimmered faintly across the water now. David leaned back in his chair slowly. You know, he said quietly, Dad used to show me photos of Naples all the time. I looked up. He did. David nodded once. He wanted you to have mornings near the beach. A faint smile touched his mouth. Said you deserved peace after putting up with him for 40 years. A laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Small. Broken. But real. Harold always joked that he was difficult to live with because he left coffee cups everywhere and forgot anniversaries unless reminded twice. The truth was simpler. He made life feel safe. And after he died, nothing ever felt fully safe again. Until now. Maybe. David interrupted my thoughts quietly. There's something else I need to tell you. The seriousness in his tone made my stomach tighten again. What is it? She emptied several joint accounts before leaving. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course she did. How much? Enough. That answer told me everything. David stared toward the rain-streaked window. I don't even care about the money anymore. No. This had moved beyond money days ago. Now it was about trust. Identity. Reality itself. Because betrayal rearranges your memories. Suddenly every holiday photo starts looking suspicious. Every smile becomes evidence. Every kind gesture feels rehearsed. I understood now why people become bitter after things like this. Not because anger consumes them, because certainty disappears. David stood and walked slowly toward the bookshelf near my couch. His eyes landed on an old framed photo from his college graduation. Harold stood beside him proudly. Vanessa stood beside me. Beautiful smile. Perfect posture. One hand resting lightly against David's back like she already owned the future. She used to be different, he whispered. I studied the photograph carefully. No, I said softly. He turned toward me. She just used to hide it better. The apartment grew quiet again. Then suddenly David laughed once under his breath. What? You know what the attorney asked me this morning? I shook my head. He asked why nobody visited the condo in person for 3 years. A strange feeling moved through me then. Not shame. Clarity. Because the answer was painfully simple. Vanessa always controlled the details. She insisted paperwork was stressful. Travel was inconvenient. Property managers were handling everything. And we believed her because modern life trains people not to look too closely at anything, especially family. David rubbed his jaw tiredly. He said financial abuse involving elderly relatives happens more than people realize. Elderly relatives. The phrase stung slightly. Not because it was untrue. Because society says those words like older people become categories instead of human beings. I looked around my apartment again. The faded curtains. The rattling heater. The tiny kitchen where I had quietly survived, while someone else lived comfortably off my future. Then I looked back at the condo keys in my hand. And for the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar. Possibility. Not revenge. Not victory. Just possibility. David checked his watch eventually. I should head back. I nodded slowly. Neither of us mentioned Vanessa again. There was nothing left to say right now. At the door he hesitated. Then quietly asked, "Do you hate me?" The question hit me harder than anything else had. I walked toward him slowly. At 38, my son was taller than Harold ever was. Broader shoulders too. But standing there in my doorway, he suddenly looked heartbreakingly young again. Like the little boy who used to wait beside the window for me to come home from work. I reached up and touched his cheek gently. "No," I said. His eyes filled instantly. "I should have protected you." I swallowed carefully. Then protect what's left. For a moment I thought he might cry. Instead he nodded once. Then he left. I stood in the doorway watching his SUV disappear into the wet Seattle streets until the taillights vanished completely into traffic. Only then did I close the door softly behind me. The apartment felt different now. Still small. Still worn. But somehow less suffocating. I walked back to the kitchen table and picked up the Florida keys again. Palm tree keychain. Warm weather.
Second chance.
For years, my world had grown smaller and smaller without me realizing it. Now suddenly, somewhere far away near the ocean, a door was waiting for me to open it. 3 weeks later, I stood barefoot on the balcony of the condo and watched the Gulf shimmer beneath the morning sun. The air smelled like salt and sunscreen and fresh coffee drifting up from somewhere below. Warm wind moved gently through my silver hair. For the first time in years, I wasn't cold. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and stared at the water in silence. This was the life Harold and I planned together. Slow mornings. Ocean air. No alarms. No fear every time the mailbox filled with bills. And yet standing there now felt bittersweet in ways I hadn't expected. Because part of me still couldn't stop thinking about the years that had been stolen before I arrived. The condo itself was beautiful. Too beautiful. Cream-colored walls. Marble countertops. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water. The guest bedroom still smelled faintly like lavender cleaning products from the property company. Vanessa had kept it immaculate. Of course she had. That woman understood appearances better than anyone I'd ever met. I slowly walked through the living room again, touching furniture carefully like I still wasn't convinced it belonged to me. Harold would have loved the balcony. I could picture him there already. Baseball cap. Newspaper folded beside him. Complaining about seagulls stealing shrimp from tourists. The thought made my chest ache softly. Grief changes with age. It stops screaming eventually. Then it whispers forever. My phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. "David." I answered quietly. "Good morning. You sound happier." I looked toward the ocean again. "I sound warm." That made him laugh softly for the first time in weeks. Hearing it nearly brought tears to my eyes. There had been so little laughter lately. "How's the condo?" he asked. I glanced around slowly. Too expensive for me to touch anything. "Mom." "I'm serious. I used a coaster under my orange juice this morning because the countertops scared me." Another small laugh. Then silence settled between us again. Not uncomfortable silence. Healing silence. Finally David spoke more carefully. "She filed another motion yesterday." There it was. Reality returning. I leaned against the kitchen island slowly. "What now?" "She wants partial ownership of the condo profits." Of course she did. Even now. Even after everything. I closed my eyes briefly. Does she ever stop? David sounded exhausted again. I honestly don't know anymore. Neither did I. That was the frightening thing about people like Vanessa. There's never enough. Enough money. Enough control. Enough reassurance. They keep taking because emptiness inside them keeps growing too. I walked toward the balcony doors again. Below, an older couple walked slowly along the beach holding hands. Matching sun hats. Matching white sneakers. Harold and I would have looked exactly like that eventually. She contacted me directly yesterday, David admitted suddenly. I frowned. Why? She said you manipulated me. I almost laughed. At 70 years old, I apparently had become a criminal mastermind while shopping with grocery coupons and driving a rattling Toyota. What did you say? David was quiet for a moment. Then, I told her she underestimated you because you were kind. The words settled deeply into my chest. Kind. Not weak. Not helpless. Kind. There's an important difference people like Vanessa never understand. Kind people see ugliness clearly. We just hope long enough for others to choose better. I sat down carefully on one of the balcony chairs. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead, bright beneath the Florida sun. Back in Seattle, everything always felt gray after Harold died. Gray skies. Gray mornings. Gray loneliness. But here, the world still looked alive. David interrupted my thoughts softly. The attorneys think we'll win. I looked down at the condo keys resting beside my coffee cup. Palm tree keychain. Second life. I don't care about winning anymore, I admitted. What do you care about? The question surprised me. I thought about it carefully before answering. Peace. Real peace. Not survival disguised as independence. Not pretending everything is fine so nobody worries. Actual peace. David exhaled slowly on the other end of the phone. I'm trying, Mom. I believed him. For the first time in years I truly did. After we hung up, I spent the afternoon unpacking slowly. Not because there were many belongings. Because there weren't. That realization hurt too. At some point during the years after Harold died, my life had quietly shrunk down to only essentials. A few sweaters. Photographs. Prescription bottles. 2 boxes of books. That was all. Vanessa hadn't just stolen money. She stole expansion. Experiences. Possibilities. I paused while placing Harold's photograph on the bedroom dresser. Sunlight spilled softly across the silver frame. You would have hated her eventually, I told him quietly. The room stayed silent except for distant waves outside. Later that evening, someone knocked softly at the condo door. I froze instantly. Nobody knew I was here except David and the attorneys. For one brief terrible second, I imagined Vanessa standing outside somehow. But when I opened the door, an elderly woman with bright white curls smiled warmly at me. Hi there, she said. I'm Carol from 4B. I saw the lights on and figured. The condo was finally occupied. Occupied. Such a simple word. And yet hearing it nearly broke my heart. For 3 years this place sat here waiting for me while I struggled alone hundreds of miles away. Carol held up a pie dish. Key lime pie, she announced proudly. Building tradition. I stared at her for a second too long before smiling. That's very kind. Well, she said cheerfully, you look like someone starting over. The words caught me off guard. Starting over. At 70. I stepped aside slowly to let her in. And for the first time since this nightmare began, the condo finally started feeling like home. A week after I moved into the condo, I finally began sleeping through the night again. Not perfectly. Grief still wakes you sometimes. So does betrayal. But for the first time in years, I no longer woke up panicking about bills. That alone felt strange. Every morning, sunlight poured through the bedroom curtains around 6:30. Warm golden light. Nothing like Seattle's endless gray skies. I started walking the beach before breakfast. Mostly older couples filled the shoreline at that hour. Retirees carrying folding chairs. Women in oversized hats collecting shells. Men comparing fishing stories nobody else fully listened to. There was comfort in that. Aging feels less lonely when everyone around you is aging too. Carol from 4B quickly became part of my routine. Every morning she knocked on my door around 8 carrying either gossip, pastries, or both. She's 82 and survived 3 husbands. Another neighbor whispered to me one afternoon near the mailboxes. That woman fears absolutely nothing. I believed it instantly. That Thursday, Carol sat at my kitchen island eating blueberry yogurt while I sliced strawberries. You've got sad eyes, she announced suddenly. I nearly laughed. Good morning to you too. I'm serious, she said, pointing her spoon at me. You smile politely, but your eyes still look like somebody stole your favorite song. The words settled quietly into my chest. Maybe that's exactly what betrayal does. Turns your life into something unfamiliar. I set the strawberries down carefully. My daughter-in-law stole money from me. Carol blinked once. Well, she said calmly, that explains the eyes. I laughed then. Really laughed. Short. Unexpected. Human. It startled both of us. Carol smiled knowingly. There you are. There who is? The woman underneath all the sadness. I looked down at the counter for a moment. For years I had stopped thinking about myself as a woman at all. Just a widow. A mother. A grandmother. A person surviving quietly in the background. Vanessa had encouraged that without me noticing. Every practical gift. Every subtle comment about slowing down. Every time she spoke to me in that overly patient voice people use with the elderly. Eventually you start shrinking yourself voluntarily. That afternoon David called while I was watering plants on the balcony. How's Florida treating you? I smiled faintly. My knees hurt less. That's promising. There was warmth in his voice again lately. Not forced politeness. Real warmth. We were learning each other again slowly. Painfully. Like strangers rebuilding a bridge neither realized had collapsed. Then his tone changed slightly. She posted about you online. I stopped watering immediately. What? David sighed heavily. She made this whole statement about family betrayal and manipulation. Of course she did. People like Vanessa never leave quietly. What exactly did she say? That you isolated me emotionally after Dad died. He sounded disgusted. And that you manipulated me into turning against her for financial reasons. I leaned against the balcony railing slowly. The gulf shimmered peacefully below me while somewhere far away my former daughter-in-law rewrote reality online for strangers. Are people believing her? A few. That hurt more than I expected. Not because strangers mattered. Because lies become dangerous once they sound polished enough. David continued quietly. My attorney told me not to respond publicly. Smart advice. Still exhausting. I looked toward the beach again. Carol was below near the pool arguing loudly with a maintenance worker about palm tree trimming. Life continuing normally. Meanwhile my family remained scattered in pieces across the country. Mom. I realized David was still waiting for me to answer. I'm here. You okay? I thought about it honestly, then said, yes. And surprisingly, I meant it. Not because the situation stopped hurting, because I no longer felt trapped inside it. That evening I opened one of Harold's old photo albums while rainstorms rolled softly across the ocean outside. There we were at 35. Camping in Oregon. Laughing beside a broken tent. There we were again at 52 dancing terribly at our anniversary party. And there was David at 7 years old missing his front teeth while holding up a fish half his size. I touched the photograph gently. Families are strange things. You build them slowly over decades believing love alone will protect them. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Around 9 that night my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Almost. But something told me not to. Hello. Silence. Then Vanessa's voice. Soft. Controlled, familiar. You look happy in Florida. My entire body stiffened instantly. How did you get this number? I still know things about this family. Of course she said family. Not your son. Not David. Family. Always framing herself at the center. I walked slowly toward the balcony doors. What do you want, Vanessa? A pause. Then quietly. You think you won. The words didn't sound angry. They sounded offended. Like someone upset the game ended before they finished playing. I never wanted a war with you, I said tiredly. She laughed softly. That's your problem, Linda. You never realize you're in a war until it's already over. Coldness spread slowly through my chest. Not fear. Recognition. Because for the first time, I finally understood exactly who she was. Not impulsive. Not emotional. Strategic. Every smile. Every holiday. Every favor. Calculated. Vanessa spoke again. You know David will eventually resent you for this. I closed my eyes briefly. No, I said quietly. He'll resent himself. Silence followed. Then for the first time since I'd known her, Vanessa sounded uncertain, just for a second, and that second told me everything. Because manipulators survive by controlling guilt. Once guilt disappears, so does their power. I lowered my voice calmly. You didn't lose because you stole money, Vanessa. She said nothing. You lost because you forgot older women still notice things eventually. Then I hung up. My hands trembled afterward. Not from fear. From adrenaline. For years I stayed quiet to keep peace inside my family. But peace built on silence isn't peace. It's surrender. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the gulf while waves crashed against the shore below. And for the first time in a very long time, I no longer felt invisible. 2 days later, David flew to Florida. I met him in the condo lobby just after noon. The moment the elevator doors opened, I barely recognized him. Not because he looked different physically, because he looked tired in a way expensive suits can't hide. His shoulders sagged slightly beneath his navy jacket. His beard had grown uneven. There were shadows beneath his eyes now that no amount of money or sleep seemed able to erase. Divorce exhaustion. Betrayal exhaustion. The kind that settles deep under the skin. Hey, Mom. I hugged him tightly for the first time in years. Really hugged him. Not the quick polite embraces we'd fallen into after Harold died. For a few seconds he held on to me like he was afraid to let go. Then he quietly whispered, I'm sorry. Again. Always that same apology now. As though repeating it enough times might somehow repair the past. I pulled back gently. You're here, I said. That matters more. Upstairs, sunlight flooded the condo living room while waves rolled lazily beyond the balcony windows. David stood there silently for a moment staring at the ocean. This place is beautiful. It was supposed to be ours, I answered softly. Ours. Mine and Harold's. The sentence lingered heavily between us. David walked slowly onto the balcony. I can't stop thinking about Dad, he admitted. Neither could I. Especially here. Harold existed everywhere inside this condo despite never seeing it himself. In the coffee mugs I chose. In the fishing boats below. In the empty second balcony chair beside mine every morning. David leaned against the railing. She called me 36 times yesterday. I sighed quietly. Did you answer? No good. Some conversations stop healing once repeated too many times. Inside, I prepared iced tea while David reviewed paperwork spread across the kitchen counter. Legal notices. Bank records. Divorce filings. At one point he suddenly muttered, She forged your signature twice. I froze mid-step. What? David rubbed his forehead hard. The attorney found documents connected to the property transfer. My stomach tightened painfully. Even now, hearing new details still shocked me somehow. She signed your name? He nodded slowly. I sat down carefully across from him. The ocean sparkled peacefully outside while my family continued collapsing in legal documents across the kitchen table. Life is strange that way. Beauty and ugliness rarely wait for separate moments. David stared down at the papers. She keeps claiming she did everything for us. For herself, I corrected quietly. He looked up slowly. Yes, he admitted. For herself. That realization seemed to hurt him most. Not that Vanessa lied. That he spent years mistaking selfishness for love. Around sunset, we walked along the beach together. The air smelled warm and salty while pelicans skimmed low across the water. Neither of us spoke much. Some point, David suddenly said. She isolated you slowly. I looked over at him. She isolated both of us. His expression shifted slightly. Because that was the truth too. Manipulation rarely destroys only one relationship. It spreads quietly through entire families like smoke. David kicked absent-mindedly at the sand. She used to tell me you judged her. I almost smiled sadly. I barely knew her well enough to judge her. That made him laugh softly under his breath. Then he grew serious again. She said you blamed her for Dad's death. I stopped walking. What? David immediately looked ashamed. I know that's insane now. But once upon a time, he believed enough of it to repeat the distance. That realization hurt more than I expected. Because grief makes people vulnerable. After Harold died, all three of us had drowned differently. I disappeared into loneliness. David disappeared into work. Vanessa disappeared into control. Only one of us came back human. We resumed walking slowly. Couples passed us holding hands beneath the orange-pink evening sky. Retirement looked so peaceful from far away. Nobody talks enough about how much pain people carry into old age before they finally reach quiet places like this. Back at the condo later that night, David stood alone on the balcony staring into darkness. "You know what scares me most?" he asked quietly. "What?" I almost became someone I wouldn't recognize. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. He turned toward me slowly. "If you hadn't said what condo that night," he swallowed hard, "I think this would have continued forever." Maybe. That was the frightening part. Entire lives can disappear beneath silence if nobody asks the right question at the right moment. I walked onto the balcony beside him. Warm wind moved softly around us. "You came back," I said. He looked down. "Barely." I reached for his hand gently. When children are young, mothers protect them physically. When they grow older, sometimes we protect them by reminding them who they were before the world changed them. David squeezed my hand once, then quietly said, "I filed for divorce this morning." The words settled into the dark air between us. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just sad. Very sad. I nodded slowly. "How do you feel?" He stared toward the black ocean. Like someone burned my entire future down. I understood that feeling too well. Because betrayal doesn't only destroy the present, it destroys the future you already imagined. The retirement years, the grandchildren growing up together, the holiday tables, the version of life you thought was waiting ahead. All gone. David finally looked at me again. "But weirdly," he admitted softly, "I feel closer to you than I have in years." My chest tightened painfully. Because underneath everything else, that had been the real theft. Not money. Not property. Time. Years we lost believing distance was normal. A wave crashed loudly against the shore below. Then another. And another. Steady. Endless. Like life itself continuing whether families survive or not. The court hearing lasted less than 40 minutes. 40 minutes to officially dismantle a marriage that had quietly poisoned our family for years. I sat beside David inside a cold conference room overlooking downtown Naples while attorneys shuffled papers and spoke in calm professional voices. Vanessa arrived 10 minutes late. Perfect hair. Cream-colored designer suit. Diamond earrings I suspected were probably purchased with stolen money. She looked beautiful. That was always her greatest talent. Looking polished while everything underneath rotted. For a brief second our eyes met across the room. She smiled politely. As if we were distant acquaintances attending the same fundraiser instead of two women standing in the wreckage of the same family. I looked away first. Not out of fear. Out of exhaustion. At some point you stop wanting revenge and start wanting peace more. David sat rigid beside me while attorneys discussed asset freezes and fraud investigations. The legal language blurred together after a while. LLCs. Transfers. Unauthorized signatures. Restitution. Cold words for deeply personal wounds. Vanessa barely reacted through most of it. Until the condo was mentioned. Her attorney cleared his throat carefully. My client maintained she managed the property under the assumption it was part of the marital portfolio. Portfolio. There it was again. That ability wealthy people sometimes have to rename cruelty until it sounds respectable. I folded my hands quietly in my lap. The judge reviewed several documents silently. Then finally asked, "Mrs. Mercer, did you ever personally authorize transfer of ownership?"
"No," he answered calmly.
Vanessa shifted slightly beside her attorney. The judge nodded once. And just like that, years of manipulation suddenly looked much smaller beneath fluorescent courtroom lighting. That surprised me most. Outside the family, people like Vanessa lose power quickly. Because strangers evaluate facts. Families evaluate emotions. After the hearing ended, Vanessa approached us in the hallway. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor. "Linda," she said softly. I turned slowly. Up close she looked tired too. Not defeated. Just thinner somehow. Like maintaining control had finally become exhausting. I never hated you, she said suddenly. The statement caught me off guard. For a moment I simply stared at her. Then quietly replied, that almost makes it worse. Her expression flickered slightly. As I meant it. Hatred at least contains emotion. What Vanessa felt toward me was colder. Utility. I was useful when I babysat. Useful when I hosted holidays. Useful when my assets benefited her future. Then gradually, I became an obstacle. She glanced toward David standing several feet away speaking with his attorney. You think he'll forgive you for this? She asked quietly. I looked at her carefully.
No, iyan suarat.
I think eventually he'll forgive himself. For the first time since I'd known her, Vanessa truly had no response. Because guilt had always been the language she spoke most fluently. And once people stop carrying guilt, manipulation loses oxygen. She walked away without another word. Watching her disappear down the courthouse hallway felt strangely anticlimactic.
No screaming. No dramatic breakdown.
Just a woman in expensive shoes walking alone. That's the truth about most endings. They arrive quietly after all the damage is already done. Outside, Florida sunlight flooded the parking lot. Bright, warm, blinding after the cold courthouse air. David exhaled heavily beside me. I feel sick. I understood. Some victories still taste like grief. We drove back to the condo mostly in silence. Halfway there, David suddenly laughed once under his breath. What? She really thought nobody would ever notice. I looked out the window at rows of palm trees sliding past. No, I said softly. She thought older women stopped maturing after a certain age. That was the real mistake. Society encourages invisible aging. People stop asking elderly women questions. Stop checking if they're lonely. Stop noticing whether they're surviving or simply enduring. Vanessa counted on that. At the condo, David stood on the balcony while sunset painted the ocean gold. I have to go back to Seattle tomorrow, he said quietly. I nodded slowly. The thought hurt more than I expected. Not because I feared being alone here. Because we had only just found each other again. David leaned against the railing. I don't want us drifting apart after this. We won't. He looked over at me carefully. How can you be sure? I smiled faintly. Because now we know what silence costs. The wind moved softly around us. Below, waves rolled steadily toward shore while lights flickered on across neighboring balconies. Ordinary life continuing everywhere. Finally David asked, Are you happy here? I thought about it honestly before answering. Not fully. Maybe never fully again. Some losses stay stitched into you permanently. But happiness at our age looks different anyway. Smaller. Quieter. A peaceful cup of coffee. A phone call answered honestly. A room where you finally feel safe again. Yes, I said softly. I think I am. That night after David went to bed, I sat alone on the balcony holding Harold's photograph in my lap. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath the moonlight. I made it here after all, I whispered. And somewhere deep inside myself, for the first time since Harold died, I finally believed I might survive the rest of my life without disappearing inside it. 6 months later, I stopped introducing myself as someone who had been betrayed. That may sound small, but after a certain age, identity becomes fragile. People begin describing themselves through losses. Widow, retired, abandoned mother, forgotten grandmother. For a long time I did that too. Then one morning, I caught my reflection in the condo bathroom mirror while putting on lipstick before breakfast, and a strange thought crossed my mind. I still looked like myself. Not the frightened woman sitting beneath leaking ceilings in Seattle. Not the exhausted widow counting grocery coupons alone at midnight. Just myself. Older, yes. Sadder in some places. But still here. Still alive. Still deserving of a future. Outside, sunlight spilled across the Gulf while pelicans drifted low over the water. Florida had changed me slowly. Not dramatically. Healing rarely happens dramatically. It happens quietly. In warm mornings. In answered phone calls. In dinners where nobody manipulates the conversation. In realizing peace feels unfamiliar at first because chaos used to feel normal. I carried my coffee onto the balcony and settled into my favorite chair. The same chair Harold would have stolen every morning if he'd lived long enough to join me here. I smiled softly at the thought. Some griefs stop crushing you eventually. Then they become companions instead. My phone buzzed beside me. David. Good morning, Mom. You're up early. I'm at the airport. I frowned. Slightly. Travel again? Actually, he hesitated. I'm coming to see you. Something warm moved through my chest. Not excitement exactly. Something steadier. Trust rebuilding itself carefully. 3 months earlier, David had started therapy. He talked about it openly now. The guilt. The blindness. The years lost. At first he apologized constantly. Eventually I told him something important. You cannot spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for finally waking up. That sentence changed both of us. Now when he visited, we talked honestly. Not like mother and son pretending everything was fine. Like two adults who survived the same storm differently. By noon, he arrived carrying grocery bags and looking healthier than he had in years. Less polished. More human. Look at you, I teased lightly as he unpacked vegetables in my kitchen. You finally learned avocados exist. He laughed. Therapy and divorce apparently turn men into produce shoppers. I laughed too. The sound still surprised me sometimes. There had been so many silent years. Later that evening, we cooked dinner together while music played softly through the condo speakers. Simple food. Grilled fish. Rice. Roasted vegetables. Nothing fancy. But halfway through chopping tomatoes, David suddenly stopped and looked at me. What? I asked. He swallowed hard. I missed this. So did I. That was the tragedy underneath everything else. Not the stolen money. Not the condo.
Ordinari moments.
Years of ordinary moments lost because someone benefited from keeping us emotionally distant. After dinner, we sat on the balcony watching the sunset melt into the Gulf. Orange. Pink. Gold. Beautiful enough to hurt a little. David leaned back quietly. You know, he admitted. I used to think success meant protecting myself from problems. I looked over at him. And now? I think it means paying attention before people you love start suffering silently. The honesty in his voice nearly brought tears to my eyes. Not dramatic tears. Just soft ones. The kind older people cry when life finally becomes gentle again. Night settled slowly around us. Lights flickered across neighboring balconies while waves rolled endlessly below. Finally David asked, Do you ever wish none of this happened? I thought about Vanessa. About Seattle. About the years I spent shrinking myself to avoid becoming inconvenient. Then I looked around the condo Harold once dreamed about for us. The ocean. The warmth.my son sitting beside me honestly for the first time in years. And I answered truthfully. I wish. Your father had lived long enough to see this place. David lowered his eyes. So do I. But the rest. I looked back toward the water. No, he frowned slightly. No. I shook my head slowly. Because sometimes painful things reveal truths we were surviving too blindly to notice. The silence afterward felt peaceful. Not empty. Peaceful. At 70 years old, I finally understood something nobody tells women enough. Being needed is not the same as being loved. And disappearing quietly to keep other people comfortable is not kindness. It's self-erasure. Vanessa stole money from me. But before that, I had already spent years helping erase myself voluntarily. Never asking for help. Never admitting loneliness. Never wanting to become too much. Not anymore. The wind moved gently through my silver hair while waves crashed softly below us. And for the first time in a very long time, I no longer felt like the forgotten woman at someone else's table. I felt like the owner of my own life again. And honestly, that was worth more than the condo ever was.